June 22, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. Along a 2,000-kilometer front, the war began without warning. German shells tore through the pre-dawn silence. Soviet border posts erupted in flame. Officers scrambled for orders that never came. Pilots ran toward aircraft already burning on the tarmac. In Moscow, reports flooded in. Fragmented, panicked, impossible to believe. Stalin stared at the map, not at the enemy, at the empty spaces where his generals should have been. He had spent 3 years purging them. Now, as the Reich poured across the frontier, he understood. The enemy wasn't at the border. It was in the silence of his own command. The Kremlin, late June, heavy curtains drawn, a single lamp over the war table. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and old paper. Maps curled at the edges. Telephones rang, unanswered. Aides moved quietly, afraid to speak. Stalin stood motionless. His pipe had gone cold. Outside, Moscow carried on, unaware that the largest invasion in history had just begun. Streetcars ran, factories hummed, loudspeakers played music. But inside this room, time had stopped. The reports kept coming. Entire divisions gone. Airfields destroyed before a single plane took off. Communications cut. Command structures collapsing. And beneath it all, a pattern Stalin now saw clearly. Not chaos. Absence. The Red Army wasn't failing because of cowardice or sabotage. It was failing because there was no one left to lead it. The officers who understood combined arms, logistics, mobile defense, the men who had trained for this exact scenario, were gone. Most were dead. The rest in the gulag. Stalin had killed them himself. It hadn't always been this way. 3 years earlier, the Red Army was the largest military force on Earth. 5 million men under arms. 30,000 tanks, more than all other nations combined. An officer corps trained in the most modern doctrines of mechanized warfare. Men like Mikhail Tukhachevsky had revolutionized Soviet military theory. Deep operations, combined arms, strategic aviation, concepts that would define modern war. Stalin had trusted them, promoted them, built the army around them, and then came 1937. The accusations began quietly, whispers of conspiracy, allegations of contact with German intelligence, show trials in Moscow, confessions extracted in basement cells. Tukhachevsky was arrested in May, executed in June. Within weeks, the purge accelerated. 3 of 5 marshals shot. 13 of 15 army commanders, no shot. 57 of 85 corps commanders, gone. All 11 vice commissars of defense, eliminated. Stalin believed he was rooting out traitors, securing the revolution, making the army loyal. The NKVD provided evidence, names, networks, proof of sabotage, and Stalin signed the orders, thousands of them. By 1939, over 40,000 officers had been purged. The army had been cleansed, or so he thought. But loyalty, it turned out, was not the same as competence. And competence could not be rebuilt in 2 years. Now, as Barbarossa unfolded, that distinction had become catastrophically clear. The numbers arrived in waves typed on thin paper, delivered by trembling aides, each one worse than the last. Day 1, the Western Military District. Communications lost. Baltic Fleet Air Arm. 600 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Brest Fortress. Surrounded, cut off. Day 2. 1,200 Soviet aircraft gone. Most never left the runway. Minsk under threat. 4th Army. Encircled. Day 3. German panzers 200 kilometers inside Soviet territory. 3 entire mechanized corps shattered. No coherent defense line exists. Stalin read each report in silence. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a temporary setback. This was systemic collapse. The Western Front had 44 divisions. Within a week, 24 would cease to exist. But the aircraft losses revealed something worse. The Soviet Air Force had been caught on the ground not because of surprise. Intelligence had warned of German buildup for weeks, but because no one had authority to act. The new commanders promoted after the purge were junior officers suddenly thrust into corps-level command. They were competent at battalion tactics, adequate at regimental maneuvers, but they didn't understand operational art. They didn't know how to coordinate armies across hundreds of kilometers, how to manage logistics for mechanized warfare, how to anticipate enemy movements 3 days ahead. More critically, they were terrified to make decisions without permission from Moscow. The purge had taught a brutal lesson. Initiative was dangerous. Independent thinking was suspect. Better to wait for orders than risk being accused of sabotage. So they waited. And while they waited, the Luftwaffe destroyed their planes. Wehrmacht armor punched through static defenses. Entire fronts disintegrated. The industrial numbers were even worse. Soviet factories could produce 1,000 tanks per month. But those tanks needed trained crews. Crews needed trained officers. Officers needed tactical doctrine. The doctrine writers were dead. The training academies had been gutted. The institutional knowledge, built over 2 decades, had been erased. You couldn't rebuild that in months, or even years. Stalin had always understood industrial capacity, steel output, production quotas, the mathematics of total war. What he hadn't understood was that armies were not factories. You couldn't simply replace a division commander the way you replaced a factory director. Command was an art, built through experience, refined through study, passed down through mentorship. He had severed that chain. And now, as German forces drove deeper into Soviet territory each day, the cost of that severance became impossible to deny. The Red Army wasn't losing because it lacked equipment. It was losing because it had forgotten how to fight. June 28th, 6 days into the invasion. Minsk had fallen. The pocket was closing around Bialystok. Over 300,000 Soviet troops were about to be encircled. Stalin called a meeting of the State Defense Committee. The room was silent as he entered. No one met his eyes. Timoshenko, the defense commissar, stood at the map. His hands shook slightly as he pointed to the front lines. "The situation is difficult, Comrade Stalin." Difficult. The word hung in the air like smoke. Stalin looked at the map, at the arrows pushing east, at the circles marking surrounded units, at the empty spaces where entire armies had simply vanished from the order of battle. "Where is Pavlov?" Stalin asked. General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, the front that had collapsed in 4 days. "He has been recalled to Moscow," Timoshenko said quietly. Stalin nodded. Pavlov would be shot within weeks. Scapegoated for a disaster he had no ability to prevent. But even as Stalin made that decision, something else was happening. A realization creeping, undeniable. Shooting Pavlov wouldn't restore the Western Front. It wouldn't bring back the trained staff officers. Wouldn't resurrect the dead generals who understood German blitzkrieg tactics because they had invented the Soviet equivalent. The men he'd had shot in 1937 and 1938. Men he'd believed were traitors. Those men would have known what to do. Tukhachevsky would have recognized the danger of static defense against mobile armor. Yegorov would have organized a strategic withdrawal instead of futile stand-fast orders. Uberevich would have coordinated counterattacks at the operational level. But they were gone, and the men who replaced them, loyal, yes, obedient, absolutely, were in over their heads. Stalin had always believed that will could overcome material reality. That ideological purity was worth any cost. That loyalty mattered more than expertise. The war was teaching him otherwise. Germany hadn't invaded with more tanks. Soviet production exceeded German capacity. Germany hadn't invaded with more men. The Red Army was larger. But Germany had something the Soviets no longer possessed: institutional competence at every level of command. German junior officers made tactical decisions without waiting for approval. German staff officers coordinated complex operations across multiple army groups. German generals understood the tempo of mechanized warfare because they'd been practicing it for years, against opponents who also knew what they were doing. The Red Army had been practicing against itself, against commanders who were terrified, against a doctrine that no longer existed. And now, they were paying the price. Stalin looked at the map again, not at where the Germans were, at where his own forces should have been, where competent leadership would have positioned them, where the institutional knowledge he'd destroyed would have saved them. The thought formed slowly, precisely, coldly. He had done this. Not Hitler, not the Wehrmacht. The catastrophe unfolding across the Western Soviet Union. The burning cities, the encircled armies, the hundreds of thousands about to die or be captured. This was his doing. He had crippled his own military, gutted its leadership, destroyed its ability to think. And there was no way to undo it, not in weeks, not in months, not in time. The failure wasn't just about missing generals, it was deeper, structural, a cascading collapse that touched every level of the Soviet war machine. The command system had broken. Before the purge, the Red Army operated on a principle called deep operations, coordinated offensives across multiple echelons, synchronized in time and space. It required constant communication between front, army, corps, and division commanders. But communication required trust, and trust had been destroyed. After 1937, every officer knew the statistics, knew that speaking frankly could mean arrest, that disagreeing with superiors could mean a bullet, that surviving meant silence, compliance, and passing responsibility upward. So when Barbarossa began, junior commanders waited for orders, senior commanders waited for Moscow, and Moscow, overwhelmed, paralyzed, gave contradictory instructions or none at all. The result? Command paralysis at the decisive moment. Soviet tanks sat immobile while fuel trucks were destroyed by Stuka dive bombers, because no one had authority to disperse them. Fortified positions were abandoned without a fight, because retreat orders never arrived and staying meant encirclement. Reserve divisions marched toward the front in parade formation along main roads and were slaughtered by the Luftwaffe. These weren't tactical errors. They were institutional failures. The logistics system collapsed next. Pre-war, the Red Army had trained officers specifically for rear area operations. Supply, transport, medical evacuation, the unglamorous work that kept armies functional. Most of those specialists had been purged. The new logistics officers were political appointees or hastily promoted juniors. They understood quotas, how many tons of ammunition to ship, but they didn't understand distribution, how to get those tons to the units that needed them when they needed them under fire. So ammunition piled up at railheads 200 kilometers behind the lines. While frontline units ran out and surrendered, food rotted in warehouses. While soldiers went hungry, medical supplies sat unused. While wounded men died, the Germans exploited every weakness. Wehrmacht intelligence had studied the purge carefully. They knew the Soviet command structure was brittle, knew that cutting communications would create chaos. So German doctrine emphasized disruption over destruction. Paratroopers seized communication nodes, armor bypassed strong points to hit headquarters. Aircraft targeted command posts, not just tanks. Every strike was calculated to sever the Red Army's nervous system, and it worked, because there was no redundancy left. No experienced officers who could take initiative when the plan fell apart. The institutional memory that might have adapted, improvised, survived, That memory had been purged. Stalin had believed he was creating an army of loyal soldiers. Instead, he'd created an army of obedient victims. Loyal, yes, but incapable. And now, as encirclement followed encirclement, as German spearheads drove toward Smolensk, toward Kiev, toward Leningrad, the mechanism of defeat was clear. The Red Army wasn't being outfought, it was being outcommanded, not by better German generals, but by the absence of Soviet ones. The war would go on. The Soviets would eventually learn, adapt, promote new officers through brutal trial by fire. But that learning would cost millions of lives, lives that might have been saved if the teachers had not already been shot. By the end of 1941, the numbers told a story no propaganda could hide. 3.8 million Soviet soldiers captured, 20,000 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 21,000 artillery pieces lost, over 4 million military casualties. The Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow. Leningrad was under siege. Ukraine had fallen. The disaster Stalin feared most had materialized, not because of treachery, but because he had eliminated the men who could have prevented it. The Red Army would recover. Eventually. Officers would learn through catastrophe what they should have learned in peacetime. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, survivors who'd been imprisoned or demoted during the purge, would rise again. They would master the art of modern war through sheer, brutal experience. But the cost was unspeakable. Every encircled army was a classroom of dead instructors, and every failed offensive was a lesson written in blood. Every retreating front was a generation of knowledge lost forever. The Soviet Union would win the war. Industrial capacity, strategic depth, and the willingness to absorb horrific casualties would eventually turn the tide. But victory came at a price that might have been avoided. Had Stalin trusted his officers instead of killing them? Had loyalty not been purchased with terror? Had competence been valued as much as obedience? In the Kremlin, as winter closed in and German forces stalled before Moscow, Stalin never spoke of the purge, never acknowledged the connection between 1937 and 1941. But he knew, in the quiet moments between reports and orders and strategic decisions, he knew. The enemy he'd feared had never existed. The conspiracy, the treason, the network of saboteurs, phantoms extracted through torture and fed back to him as intelligence. The real threat had been his own paranoia. And by the time he understood that, 3 million Soviet soldiers were already dead. History would remember the Great Patriotic War as a triumph. And it was. But it began as a tragedy, a self-inflicted wound, a reminder that in war the most dangerous enemy is sometimes the one you create yourself, not through weakness, but through the destruction of your own strength.